Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my August wrap up. Today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in the month of August. So in the month of August I read 15 books. 5 of them were unpublished books that I read for work, so I can't talk about them here, but I do have 10 books that I can talk to you about. So in the month of August I was going through what I called my Clear Out TBR, which is a video I made at the beginning of August where I talked about books that have been on my shelf for a while that I wasn't that excited about and how I was going to try and get to some of them this month. So I read 7 books off of my Clear Out TBR, of which there were 15, which I think is pretty good going. I got through nearly half of them, and then I read 3 books that were not on that TBR as well. So I will start off with the 3 books I read which were not for the Clear Out TBR and then get on to the Clear Out books. Starting off with the classics, this month my Anthony Trollope book was The Prime Minister. This is the 5th book in the Palliser series and my favourite so far, I think I'm going to say. I love this a lot. It was a really fantastic read. We follow various characters, including a man called Ferdinand Lopez, who wants to marry a particular woman whose father doesn't want him to marry that particular woman, and that's kind of one dramatic plotline going on. And then we also follow Mr. Palliser, who is a recurring character throughout the series, and his life and his marriage and his political career when he becomes the Prime Minister. This is really good, definitely Trollope at his best. There are 2 things especially that I think Trollope does fantastically. One is writing about slightly dysfunctional marriages, and the other is writing about unrequited love. And both of those things are done brilliantly in this book in a really wonderful way. I also enjoyed the way it looked at politics. I think this is the book in the Palliser series so far where I have most enjoyed the political content, where usually that's like the thing I like less than the kind of social content, but actually the politics plot lines in here were really interesting too. The characterisation as always is fantastic, Trollope's writing is brilliant, and I love this a lot. Considering I have read quite a lot of Anthony Trollope books so far this year, this is my first 5-star Anthony Trollope book this year, and it did remind me of all of the reasons why I adore Trollope. So yeah, this is a fantastic book. I then also read Quartet in Autumn by Barbara Pym. I really like Barbara Pym. This is the 2nd book I've read by her, the first being Excellent Women, which I read a couple of years ago, and this is a book from the 70s, so a kind of modern classic, and it follows 4 different people who work in the same office, all of whom are like about retirement age and soon to retire, or sort of do retire over the course of the book, and they're all very lonely. And this book is in many ways a book about loneliness. It's very sad in places, but it's also really powerful and has like little bits of hope in it. It's a really powerful book, and one I would definitely recommend. Barbara Pym writes wonderfully, and she writes really well about kind of social situations in minute detail, kind of picking up on the small details of everyday life in a sort of Jane Austen-esque way, I would say. So yeah, I would highly recommend Quartet in Autumn, and indeed just anything by her. Then I also listened to the audiobook of Villa of Secrets by Patricia Wilson, and this is a book that's published by Zaffa where I work. I work on Patricia Wilson's front list, and this is one of her backlist books, so I was just catching up on a few of her books that were published before I worked there. This tells the story of a family living in Greece in the present day, of 2 sisters who haven't spoken for the last 10 years, and of one of the sisters' relationship with her grandmother, and over the course of the book she learns a lot more about her grandmother and her grandmother's past, and we also get narrative glimpses into her grandmother's life during the Second World War. It's a really powerful book and a great summer read. But moving on to the books from my Clear Out TBR, so I feel like I was slightly right to say that I wasn't very excited about a lot of these books, because of the 7 that I read in August, 1 I gave 5 stars to, so that was a hidden gem. 1 I gave 4 stars to, another like really good book that I am really glad that I read. And then the other 5 I gave 2 or 3 stars to and didn't get that much out of. So I will be unhauling some of them. I'm kind of glad that I finally got them, but also I feel like I was slightly right to not be overly excited to get to them. So yeah, the rest of this video may not be that positive. One book that I did not get very much out of at all was Last Tango in Aberystwyth by Malcolm Price. This is the 2nd book in a detective series. I read the first one a few years ago and gave it 3 stars. I remember thinking it was okay and I quite enjoyed it, but I didn't love it. However, that was before I was like into mysteries more, and now I really like Agatha Christie and a few other mystery writers. I thought I should try this series again, but I did not like it at all. It's set in a like slightly alternative version of Aberystwyth, and our detective is kind of tracking down a man who's gone missing, or at least that's what the mystery seems to be, but by the time you get to the end the mystery is actually something entirely different, which I don't mind, but I found it meant it was quite an unsatisfying ending, because the stakes just kept on changing, and I think I like a much more straightforward mystery. Another thing that I struggle with in this book is that I thought, it being a detective series, it would stand fairly separate from the first one, but actually it is a very direct sequel to the first book. And I read the first book quite a few years ago, and I didn't remember it well enough to get along with this. Like, a lot of this, I was just so confused about what was going on. And I don't know whether that was because it was written confusingly or because it had been so long since I read the first book that there was just lots of details I'd missed out. I also found the characterization very flat and the writing a little bit flat too. And also, and this is a minor point that wouldn't annoy everyone, but there's this really weird habit in this book where, like, every time there should be a paragraph break, there is a section break, except sometimes, but there's lots of times that there's just like random section breaks, which makes it really bitty to read, which I don't think would bother everyone, but it really frustrated me while I was reading it, because I was like, why have they made this weird decision? So yeah, I really didn't enjoy this one at all. Then I also read Autumn by Ali Smith, which I did not like very much either. I know Ali Smith is very beloved by a lot of people, but I just don't think her writing is for me. I think she's just much too literary for me, really, and I just don't get very much out of her books. It's a shame, because the first book I ever read by her, I loved, because I read it and I was like, her writing is incredible, what interesting writing, how fantastic is this? But then the only thing I really get from her work is, oh, her writing's really interesting, which means the other two novels I've read by her since, I've been like, well, the writing is impressive, but I've already been impressed by your writing once, and I'm kind of over that now, because it's just the same writing style and there's nothing else new for me to get from it. And I think that's just a very personal thing. Like I said, I just think Ali Smith is too literary for me, and I don't get enough out of pure interesting writing style to get on with her books when there's not like enough more behind it for me, or what is behind there you can't get without like close textual analysis. I don't know. This book, Autumn, follows a woman and kind of talks about her relationship with the man who lived next door to her when she was growing up. I can't really tell you what it's about more than that. I've heard a lot of people say that it's about Brexit. It talks a bit about Brexit, but I didn't really feel like it really examined any social or political issues as far as I'm concerned. I just felt like nothing really happened, and it was very introspective, and I read it 3 weeks ago and I can't remember anything more than it was about a woman and her relationship with the man she used to live next door to, who she kind of was a bit in love with, even though he was an old man and she was a child, which is a bit weird anyway, and I'm not sure I really enjoyed, and that's all I really remember from 3 weeks ago. Like, I enjoyed the writing style in this. I do think Ali Smith writes in a beautiful way, but I didn't get anything else out of it except for, oh, the writing's nice. So I finished it and I was like, yeah, but what happened? Nothing happened. I don't feel like anything was said. And like I said, I do think it's just me, because so many people I know love Ali Smith and think Autumn's like Ali Smith's best work, but I just don't think she's for me. I just think she's too literary. So this will be going to the charity shop where someone can enjoy it more than me. Then I also read Sandlands by Rosie Thornton. This is a short story collection. All of the stories are set in Suffolk, and these stories kind of look at various people living within this rural landscape. I also didn't like this very much. I don't know, this is a weird one, because the majority of the stories in here were sort of 2-star stories for me that I got next to nothing out of, where I just felt like nothing really happened and I didn't really enjoy the writing, and felt very, very distant from the characters. But then there were 2 stories in here that I did really enjoy, The Level Crossing and Curlew Call. And both of those 2 stories were like 4-star stories for me, and I did really enjoy, but every other story in the collection didn't really do anything for me. So I feel like I'm used to short story collections being hit or miss, but this was like a lot of miss and a few hits. So yeah, I think this is another one that will be going to the charity shop. I then also read An American Decade by Richard Anaronovich. This has been on my shelves for quite a long time. I was sent it for review a while ago, and this is set in the 1930s, and it follows a man who moves from Germany to America to kind of start a new life there after the death of his wife. And we follow him as he starts a new career for himself as a singer, and also as he begins to follow how things are changing in Germany while he's in New York, and how that makes him feel about the country he's from. There were some things in here that I did really like and that I thought were done really well. I think the way this book looks at history and kind of takes the whole history of the 1930s and examines it is really interesting, especially because it's looking at the history of Germany in the 1930s, but because our character is removed and in the States, you see things in a slightly different light. And in some ways he can view what's happening in Germany with more clarity than his parents and other people back home in Germany can, which I thought was really interesting. However, In general, I felt quite detached from this book, and I felt that we were quite pulled back from our main character, so I didn't really feel like I got to know him well enough. And I also found the ending quite abrupt. Like, I felt like there could have been another 50 pages quite easily here to finish off the story, because it didn't feel like the story was fully closed. I felt like the pacing was a little bit off, maybe. So I did enjoy quite a few things in here, but there were just some things which for me were just a little bit off. Then I also read White Teeth by Zadie Smith. This follows two families over quite a long period of time, sort of from the 70s to the 90s. And it follows two friends who fought together in the Second World War and know each other from there, Archie and Samad, and their wives and later their children. Now, I had a weird reading experience with this, which is actually very similar to the reading experience I had with On Beauty by Zadie Smith, which is the only other book I've read by her, where I started it, and after the first few chapters I was like, oh, this is fantastic. And then a little bit further on I was still really enjoying it. And then when it got to like the second half of the book I was like, yeah, but where is this going? And then I got to the end and I was like, but you didn't really address any of the things you set up. And it really just, I don't know. I think again, maybe it's a case of Zadie Smith being slightly too literary for me. Like, White Teeth is very meandering. I feel like this book does not need to be as long as it is and could have told a stronger, more complete, tighter story in a lot less pages than the story that is told. But I think that's partly because I don't love a super meandering book. And I think it's supposed to be meandering. I think that things are meandering and like plot points are set up which are never addressed because that's kind of what life's like. But I also therefore found it a slightly frustrating reading experience. For example, the thing that kicks off like the whole book is that Archie in the first few pages tries to commit suicide, and when that doesn't work he takes it as a sign to kind of like start his life again, and that's just never ever mentioned again throughout like the whole of the book. It's just never mentioned and it's never addressed, and I just thought that like that sums up a lot of this book, where I feel like there are a lot of plot points which were never carried through. And then I found like the very ending just quite rushed. I don't know, there were some characters in here who I absolutely loved. Irie and Alsana I could have read like a whole book about. I thought they were fantastic and really well drawn, but some of the other characters around them I didn't find as compelling. And then there were other characters such as Clara, who I really liked, but we barely got to see any of. And I kept on expecting us to go back to Clara, and we never really did. She was just always like in the background. It moves a lot between different characters, and for me that meant that I never really got to see the characters I wanted to see most. I think this book deals with a lot of really interesting themes, in a really powerful way, and there are some moments in here which are beautiful and really well done, or really powerful, or very funny, or whatever, but for me it didn't hang together as one, and I think, like I said, that's partly because it's just not quite my taste. I feel like Zadie Smith has a writing style that I like, but her books are a little too tangential for me. Another thing I would say is that I listened to the audiobook of this, and I would not recommend the audiobook, because there are 4 parts in this book, and in the audiobook they're narrated by 4 different narrators, which would be fun, except that firstly, the narrators who narrate part 1 and part 3 are very good, and the narrators who narrate part 2 and part 4 are not as good. Like, the person who narrates part 4 doesn't do any accents or any voices at all, which one I found quite difficult because I couldn't work out who was speaking. But then, like, the other 3 do accents and do voices for all the characters, but they're all slightly different, which meant you have like no consistency over the whole audiobook. They obviously didn't even like listen to each other's audio segments to like try and match their voices, so that like Archie has just like 4 different voices in the 4 different book parts, which just was a really bad listening experience. So maybe that also slightly coloured my reading experience too of White Teeth, I don't know. But yeah, I don't know whether or not I recommend the book. I think if you really like literary fiction and you don't mind something that's a bit meandering, you'll probably like it. But regardless, I would not recommend the audiobook. It was not so great at all. On to slightly more positive reads. I also read History of the Rain by Niall Williams. This is a literary fiction book following a young woman in Ireland in the present day, and she has some kind of illness. She is stuck in her bed in her attic room beneath all the rain, and over the course of this book, while she is stuck and ill, she tells the story of her sort of family's past, her grandfather and her father and her brother and her mother. And you know from the beginning that only in the house are her and her mum and her grandmother, and you don't know where her dad and her brother are. And she kind of tells the story throughout the course of the book, sort of what's happened to everyone. This is in many ways a really fantastic book. One of my favourite things in it is that the main character loves books, so there are a lot of literary references, like tons of bookish references, and every time she references a book she like puts in brackets afterwards who it's published by and what number book it is on her shelves, because all her dad's books are like numbered from 1 to like 3,000 or something, which I think is really fun, and that's just a really nice touch. And there's like so many Dickens references in here, which I loved. I also quite like the fact that because our main character is so obsessed with like 19th century literature, sometimes you forget that it's set in the present day, and then she'll like mention Facebook and you'll be like, oh yeah, this is modern. And I thought that was quite a nice technique. I think she's a really strong character, and many of the characters around her, especially Vincent Cunningham, I think are really well done. The only thing I would say is that I think this is slightly more literary than my taste. So while I really enjoyed it, sometimes there were some like big tangents, and I'd be like, can you get to the point a little bit? But like I said, I think that's a minor thing, and it didn't actually stop my enjoyment of the book, though it wasn't like my ideal writing style perhaps. I still really loved it, and I still thought it was really powerful and really interesting. Yeah, it was a really interesting book, and one I would definitely recommend, especially if you like kind of literary fiction that looks at kind of family history and is very character focused, because this is a really interesting read. And then my favourite book from my August Clear Out TBR, my hidden gem of the month, is this. This is Random Acts of Senseless Violence by Jack Womack, and this was incredible, and I'm so glad I read it. And though I read 5 books this month that I didn't especially enjoy, I feel like reading this makes up for all of that. So this is why I was doing this TBR, and this is why I don't give books to charity shops without reading them, because this was brilliant. This, I don't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting this. This is a kind of very near future sci-fi. The back of it describes it as like 10 minutes in the future, but yeah, it's near future from the 90s when it was written, and it follows this young girl who's 12 years old writing her diary. At the beginning of the book, she lives with her parents and her sister. She's had a very middle-class upbringing, and she goes to a private school in New York. And then over the course of the book, her parents start to get less and less money, and they start to struggle more and more. And at the same time, what's happening in New York City and all over the States starts to go mad, and there are lots of random acts of senseless violence, and like a lot of rioting. The presidents keep being assassinated, and things keep on going more and more wrong. She and her family have to move to a much less safe neighborhood, and she kind of ends up getting involved with people who are in gangs, and it's just fantastic. It's a really brilliant coming of age story in many ways, but like a really crazy, weird, slightly dystopian coming of age story, but in such a powerful way. Another thing I really liked in this book is that over the course of it, Lola is kind of coming to terms with her sexuality, and she's never really been interested in boys, and she starts to fancy some of her female friends, and the way that's explored is really well done as well, and really powerful. There's just so many things in this book that are fantastic. Like, it's such a brilliant coming of age story, and the dystopian stuff just makes it like even more powerful, and it is quite scary in many ways, like the world that Jack Womack paints here, but it's also fantastic, and I would highly recommend this. So yeah, out of my Clear Out TBR, this was a 5-star, and I'm definitely keeping, and I'm really excited that I finally read it, because yeah, I wouldn't have read it if I hadn't decided to read the books on my shelves that I wasn't that excited for, so that was why I did it, even though I read some less good books this month, but there we go. Anyway, those are all the books that I read in the month of August. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. I'm sure many of you will have enjoyed Ali Smith's Autumn rather more than I did, and possibly Zadie Smith as well. But yeah, let me know what your favourite book of August was, and that's it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.